This is Masechah Sanhedrin Daf Chav Daled Amud Bet, and in the Mishnah towards the bottom of the page, we learned about the Psulei Eidos and especially Masachich Bekuvia, and now we'll look at Rashi, or the Gemara had a machlokas between Rami Bar Chama, who said that gambling is an Ashmachta, is an invalid contract because there's no mental commitment full. And Rav Sheshet said, no, kol ki hagavna lav asmachta, that gambling is not an asmachta. Gambling is a contract. It's not a situation where the person has no intention to enter the contract. And the reason why it's possible to edus is for a different reason. It's because lafisha ein asukin b'yeshuva shel olam. So Rashi comes to address the definition of this concept of asmachta. And Rashi, or the Gemara seems to indicate there is such a thing as an asmachta where there's not a valid contract because the party or parties don't have full intention, but this is not that case. So Rashi begins, V'hechi dami asmachta. What would be a case of asmachta? Kigon, like a case of im ovir v'lo avid ashalim b'meitva, like the case in Bava Metzia where you have a sharecropper who owns an aspect of the field in as much as he has a right to work it and to take a percentage of the produce. So when he enters into the original contract, he makes a commitment or a condition that if he leaves the field fallow, which would ultimately damage the field itself, then he'll pay b'meitzvah, he'll pay with good quality fruits. He will pay back for the loss that he caused. Ukegon, another example, is mashlish et shtaro to get pashut, where a person owes money on a contract, and he pays partial payments and says, I promise I'll pay you the rest before a certain time. And in order to show that he's really going to do it, he gives the contract to a third party, what's called a shlish, and he makes a deal, a contract, that if he doesn't pay the remainder, that the other party, the debtor, will be able to get the contract back and be able to enforce full collection ultimately. In other words, he pays partial payment and says, I'll pay you the whole thing, plus what I paid already, again, if I don't pay you the remainder by a certain time. So in these two cases, where the sharecropper promises to work, and if not, he'll pay back, or the loaner, the borrower, promises to pay back, and if not, he'll pay back the entire loan again. In both cases, somech al lo davar, he's counting on nothing, meaning he's certain that he won't have to do these things. Desavar kol zeh bi'adi la'asos, he thinks that everything that I want to do, pay the remainder, or work the field, is in my control to be able to do it, and I'm intending to do it. So therefore, I have no intention of paying you for produce which does not grow, or paying you again for this loan. Umereisha ki masne, and at the outset, when he made the condition, adata de lo yahiv lei, he was never really intending that the possibility will exist that he will pay. Lasmachta kamasne, you're saying it as a reliance to show that you're certain that you'll do it. De toev v'savar lo yaval udekach, you're certain that it won't come to this eventuality. So therefore, since you have the control to do it and you're certain you're going to do it, when you make the contract, you don't really intend for the detrimental outcome, and therefore it's not a contract, it's an asmachta. Aval hacha, but here in the case of gambling, lo samich amidi, you're not counting on anything. Everyone knows that you're not going to always win your bets. Lo yada inatzach lo natzach. You don't know if you'll be successful. But nevertheless, you made the contract. I said, whatever the bet was, if the Yankees win, I'll pay you. If they lose, you pay me. You knew you didn't have control to make sure that your favorable outcome would happen. And therefore, you made the contract understanding that you might have to pay, you might lose. Shmamina misfeka asne. You're making the contract based on the possibilities, the suffix, the doubt, the possible outcomes. Gamar va'akni, therefore you have full intention to commit to the contract. V'lav gazelahi, and therefore if you win, you're not stealing from the other party. They were fully aware of what they were doing, and the contract is valid. So Rashi here explains Rav Sheshet why it is that a gambling contract is a valid contract, and the winner is not considered to be stealing. In contrast to Rami Bar Chama, who believes that gambling is Ashmachta. Tosfot Dibur Malchil Kol begins by quoting Rashi. The first entire section of Tosfot is quoting Rashi. Pirish HaKunshas Rashi says, Heichi Dami Ashmachta Kigonim Ovir V'lo Avid Hashalom B'Meitzvah. The case where you're of the sharecropper, V'chein Mashlish Et Shtaro, or the loaner in the parak called Get Pashut, Bava Batra. T'chol Hani Samech Adate V'Savor Shezebi Yadol Asos. In these cases, it's in your control to do it. Umereishna, and at the outset, Kimasni Le Adata Delo Yayiv Le Mas Tana Asni. The contract was banking on the fact that he won't have to pay. Sharvei Savar Hu Shalo Yavol Dekach, because they think it won't happen. Aval Hachal Lav Biyado. Here, in the case of gambling, it's not in your control. V'lo Samech Amidi, you're not counting on winning because you know you can lose. Nevertheless, you make the contract. Shema Mina, we learn from here. He made a full intention, commitment, and contract based on the Safek V'lav Gzelahi. That's Rashi. Mihu, Tosfot says one note. The first case that Rashi quoted from Baba Metzia, where the sharecropper commits to pay, Ashmachta, which Rashi called Ashmachta, ta'u sofrim zeh. This is an editorial mistake in Rashi. Rashi did not quote the case of the sharecropper. Because actually that exact case is not an Ashmachta. The Gemara in Bava Metzia actually says explicitly it's not an Ashmachta. What Rashi meant to quote was a different Gemara, the Gemara of Im Over V'lo Avid Hashalim Al Fazuzah, the same case of a sharecropper, but in this case you didn't promise to pay back to compensate for the losses of not working. But what you said is that you'll pay 1,000 zuz, in other words, an extreme amount, if you don't work the field. Even though the field, let's say, will only produce 300 zuz anyway, you say, I'm so confident I'm going to work the field that if I don't, I will pay you 1,000 zuz. And there, you did not intend to have to pay 1,000 zuz. You were just saying it to convince the other party that you're really going to do the work. That is an Ashmachta. But the case of Ashalim B'Meitva, where you're paying back the actual value of the losses, there was intention to pay back for the loss. Ubepirish Rashi, Hayakatov im ovir v'chulei. Actually, what Rashi said was im ovir, etc. And he meant for the case of im ovir v'lo ashalim, v'lo avid ashalim al fazuzah, al kain to sofrim, but the editors made a mistake and added the words ashalim b'meitzvah, which is actually a mistake. Okay, so far Tosfot is quoting Rashi and just noting one typo in the Rashi. Aval Rabbeinu Tam hikshel lefirish hakunshus, but Rabbeinu Tam has a fundamental problem with Rashi. Mishum delefi perusho mashma, it seems from Rashi, the tfei chashiv esmachta, the criteria which makes it more considered an asmachta, shehaya biado milav biado. When something is in your control, when something is in your control, it is more of an asmachta and less likely to be a contract because of the fact that you're so sure that you're going to do it, as opposed to something out of your control where you know it's out of your control and therefore you actually have intention to pay if you lose. Perak Ezer Neshach, but in the Gemara in Mesechus Bava Metzia, it sounds like it's just the opposite. Mashma Ifcha, it sounds like the opposite. And we continue to Chafei Amud Aleph. The Amar Hatam, because the case there, Hai Mad Mekabel Zuze Mechavre. Someone takes someone else's money for the purpose lemizvin lechamra, to buy for him wine. So one party is sort of acting as an agent for another party to buy wine, and he's doing it because he's going to a market where there's a favorable price for wine. Upasha v'lo, and then he goes and comes back from the sale, and he didn't buy any. Mishalem k'da'azil arpavata dezolshvot. So the Gemara says he's responsible to pay back the wine that he promised to pay at the low prices in the stores of this place called Parvata de Zolshvot. He has to pay back at the wine that he would have been able to get at the low price. In other words, he has a detriment and a loss, and meaning the contract was valid. Uka Amar Hatam, the Gemara is presuming that there was an agreement that this would happen. Uka Amar Hatam, the Ashmachta, and the Gemara says, no, he can't be responsible to pay. It's an Ashmachta. To the extent that the Gemara compares it to the case we mentioned previously of the sharecropper who promises to pay meitav, which is the same value of the loss, which is not an Ashmachta, as Tosfot already established. Umeshani, and the Gemara in Bava Metzia responds, Hatam, there, Gabi im ovir v'lo avid ashalim b'meitzvah. In that case of the sharecropper, mishum dahavi biyado, lo havi asmachta. The reason why it's not an asmachta is because it's in your control to work the field. Since it's in your control, therefore, you're committing to it. Alma, as opposed to the case of the wine, where it's not completely in your control because it's possible that you won't be able to buy it. Alma the lo havi biyado havi tfei asmachta b'mashu biyado. So apparently, out of your control makes it more of an asmachta. In your control makes it not an asmachta. And this is the opposite of what Rashi said, where Rashi said that if it's in your control, it is an asmachta because you have delusion in counting on your own abilities, whereas out of your control is not an asmachta because you know not to be counting on anything because you know it's out of your control and you're more rational in your commitments. Therefore, Rabbeinu Tam offers an alternative to Rashi and rejects Rashi. And the reason why the Mesachi B'Kuvya, the gambler, is not a smachta is a different reason. Kol ki haygavna lav asmachtahi, that when our Gemara says, there's a quote from our Gemara, when our Gemara says that this is not an asmachta, the lo havi asmachta ela heicha she'ein yachol leharviach. Tosfot says it's a different reason. The reason why gambling is not an asmachta is because it's only an asmachta when you enter a contract when you have nothing to gain. There's no consideration in the contract. Could go in mashlish at shtaro where you owe money and you pay partial and you promise to pay the rest by a certain time, otherwise you'll pay extra. In that case, you didn't benefit by making that commitment. Even though you benefited by borrowing, but that was a separate transaction. In the case of Peraket Pashut. Aval hacha, lo havi asmachta, but in the case of Mesachim B'Kuvya, it's not an asmachta, mishum, the kevan de shnayim heim, since there are two parties. Kol echad ve'echad, makni lechavre, each one commits to the other, migo, di'i marvach, ba'ihu lemiknei, because if I win, I get the money, ba'ahi hana'ah, for that benefit of the possibility of winning, and for the possibility that the other party will pay me, ba'ahi hana'ah, in exchange for that consideration, gamar umakni lechavre, therefore I commit to pay to the other one. So in other words, if you bet on a game and if the Yankees win, you pay me. If they lose, I pay you. There's a contract because there's a exchange. There's a benefit to each and a detriment to each. But if I would say, if the Yankees lose, I'll pay you $1,000, and if they win, I don't get anything, there would be no contract because I don't have anything to benefit. That is not a valid contract because it's lacking consideration. Ulefizah, and based on this, kol shiduchim lo havia asmachta. Based on this, Tosfot says that contracts that are made in engagements is a valid contract and is not an Ashmachta. This kind of the contract that Tosfot is referring to is where you have two families making a wedding, and they make a commitment to each other, the Tanaim, where they say that if I back out of the marriage, then I will pay you back X amount, and if you back out, you'll pay me X amount, because we want to cover our losses for the preparations for the wedding. Mishum dekol chad v'chad ba'i l'miknei, gamar nami umaknei, because each party stands to benefit and to lose, and there's an exchange, there's a consideration, and therefore it's considered a valid contract, even though each party makes a commitment thinking that it won't happen. Because the main criteria for Rabbeinu Tam in defining whether it's a contract or not, in the case of Ashmachta, is whether there's an exchange of benefit, whether there's consideration. As opposed to Rashi, who has the criteria of biyado versus lav biyado, but Tosfot said that would work in the opposite direction, as the Gemara proves.